The morning the accident should have happened began like any other along the edge of the Pacific, where the coastline sliced the horizon into a perfect line of steel blue water and pale sky. At Naval Air Station Point Mugu, the wind carried the familiar salt smell through the concrete corridors and across the flight line where a row of F-14 Tomcats sat waiting, their wings folded like sleeping predators. None of the men working that day had any reason to believe history was about to take shape. No one suspected that an aircraft designed to fight, to intercept, to dominate, would face a test more brutal than any dogfight. The day was quiet in the way military mornings often are, before the tempo rises. Technicians moved around the Tomcat checking hydraulic lines, tightening access panels, verifying electrical circuits. The F-14 was a magnificent but demanding machine, beautiful, dangerous, temperamental. It rewarded excellence and punished even the smallest lapse in attention. Everyone on that ramp respected it. Lieutenant Commander William Tex Gibson respected it more than most. He had flown the Tomcat for years, long enough to understand that the aircraft was a living contradiction, heavy but agile, complicated but intuitive, brutal but elegant, the kind of fighter that made mediocre pilots nervous and great pilots humble. That morning he approached aircraft Buno 161,597, an F-14A assigned to the VX for evaluators, painted in the glossy black test scheme that gave the jet a predatory gleam when the sun hit its surface. It had flown hundreds of hours and carried scars that only experienced eyes could read. It was scheduled for a routine weapon separation test, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, nothing worth remembering. At least that was what everyone thought. Gibson climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit, running through the ritual he could have performed blindfolded. Battery on, generators online, flight controls free. The cockpit around him seemed to breathe as systems powered up. Lights flickering, screens warming. Behind him his radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Tim Zulu Morrow, completed his own checklist. They joked lightly over the intercom, the comfortable banner of men who trusted each other in the kind of absolute way only fighter crews understood. When the engine sparked to life, the air trembled. Twin Pratt and Whitney TF-30s spooled up in a rising growl that rolled across the ramp, echoing off hangar walls. The Tomcat's wings, swept back for taxi, cast a jagged shadow across the concrete. Tower clearance came moments later, and Gibson released the brakes. The jet rolled forward with that familiar weight, that mechanical certainty that made the F-14 feel less like a machine and more like an extension of the pilot's will. On the catapult deck of a carrier, the Tomcat launched like a thrown spear. But from land, its takeoff was a long accelerating roar, wheels lifting only when Gibson felt the exact right point of balance between thrust, lift and instinct. The jet climbed cleanly, banking out over the ocean into a crisp, flawless sky. The world below shrank into a mosaic of cliffs and white surf. Morrow checked the telemetry feed and confirmed the separation equipment was functioning. Everything was normal, everything predictable. It was the kind of flight where pilots relaxed into the rhythm, trusting the jet, trusting the plane. The kind of flight that should have ended with a straightforward landing and a quiet walk back to squadron ops. But the sky always holds its own plans. When they reached the test block altitude, the Pacific stretched endlessly beneath them, a vast reflective sheet broken only by the faint white scars of distant ships. Gibson steadied the Tomcat, eased the nose up slightly, and prepared for the weapon's release. Morrow read off the checklist, his calm voice filling the cockpit. At the exact second of release, Gibson felt a slight shudder through the airframe. Not unusual. Tests always created small disturbances. But the next vibration was different, stronger, deeper. Wrong. Before he could process it, the world convulsed, a violent wrench threw the jet sideways. The cockpit flashed with sunlight as something massive tore free. The Tomcat rolled sharply, almost uncontrollably. Gibson's instinct snapped into full clarity, hands tightening on the stick, feet bracing on the rudder pedals. Morrow shouted that the right wing was gone, not damaged, gone, torn away completely. The F-14 entered an immediate torque roll, the remaining left wing generating lift, while the right side collapsed into empty air, dragging the jet into a twisting downward spiral. Warning lights exploded across the cockpit, alarms screaming, hydraulic pressure fluctuating in wild jumps. The nose swung down toward the ocean in a blur of blue and white. The Tomcat's signature stability vanished in an instant. Gibson fought the stick with both hands, trying to find even a sliver of control, a momentary grip against the chaos. The jet bucked again violently as the airflow slammed against the exposed root where the right wing had been. The Tomcat should have broken apart. Its airframe was never designed for a symmetry this extreme. Pilots trained for compressor stalls, for hydraulic failures, for flameouts. No one trained to fly a jet, missing half its lift. There were only two choices: regain control or eject. But ejecting from an F-14 in a flat spin or rolling dive was a gamble. Many did not survive. Gibson knew the statistics. He also knew that if he pulled the handles too early, he might throw Morrow into the jet's own tumbling debris. The ocean rose fast, the horizon twisting, the cockpit vibrating so hard the instruments blurred. Gibson tried to steady his breathing, forcing his voice to remain clear. They still had altitude barely, but enough. He rolled opposite the spin, pushing rudder hard, trimming against the impossible imbalance. The Tomcat resisted, shaking and growling like a wounded animal fighting its own death. Morrow called out airspeed and altitude numbers with rapid precision, trying to give structure to a situation that had none. Every instinct screamed to eject, but a deeper instinct the one great aviators possessed told Gibson there was still a chance. A small one, a sliver of possibility. Control inputs began to register, slightly, barely, enough. The violent roll slowed from catastrophic to desperate. The nose came up a few degrees. Not level flight. Not stable flight. Survival flight. The Pacific's surface stopped rushing closer. The horizon steadied just for a moment, but a moment was all Gibson needed. He talked the aircraft into balance, coaxing rather than commanding. The Tomcat responded with grudging cooperation, fighting the air that ripped across its mutilated frame. It was flying. Not well, not safely, but flying. And somehow the engine temperatures held. The hydraulic pressure steadied. The jet accepted the impossible. Morrow stared at the displays in disbelief. They were alive, against every rule of aerodynamics, against every expectation, against probability itself. Gibson called the emergency over the radio with a steady voice that hid the chaos he was wrestling inside the cockpit. And down below, across the operations room, across the radar screens and watch stations, no one believed what they were hearing. They had just been told an F-14 lost an entire wing, and yet the pilot was still flying it. The radio transmission spread across the operations floor like a shockwave. Controllers froze, with headsets half-raised. Technicians stared at each other in disbelief, and officers stepped toward the central screen as though proximity would somehow make the report make sense. An F-14 Tomcat missing an entire wing should have been a dead aircraft. It should have broken apart the moment lift and drag became violently asymmetrical. It should have fallen like a stone. Yet the radar return was there, steady enough to confirm the unthinkable. Gibson was still airborne. The operations supervisor, a veteran of 20 years, repeated the call twice as if expecting clarification. None came. The room shifted instantly from disbelief to action. Emergency protocols activated. Air-to-air frequencies cleared for priority traffic. Rescue teams stood by on the tarmac, but even as procedures snapped into motion, everyone understood the same truth. There was no checklist for this, no training scenario, no manual page for an aircraft that should not exist in the sky. Out over the Pacific, Gibson kept his breathing steady as he coaxed the remains of the Tomcat back towards something resembling controlled flight. The right side of the aircraft dragged like a weight tied to its frame. The airflow clawed at the exposed internal spar where the wing had sheared away. The jet trembled constantly, like a living thing caught between survival and collapse. Every second felt borrowed, Morrow kept calling out speed and altitude, his voice tight but controlled. He knew fear had no place in the cockpit. Fear sharpened too violently. What they needed was precision, the kind that gave chaos boundaries. Gibson managed a shallow climb, only a few hundred feet, but enough to buy precious seconds. The ocean no longer devoured the view beneath them. The horizon steadied as he fought asymmetrical forces with relentless micro-adjustments. He pushed left rudder almost continuously to counter the yaw, working the stick and throttle in patterns no simulator had ever taught. The Tomcat was no longer an aircraft. It was a wounded animal, powerful enough to fight back, but fragile enough to die with a single mistake. The radio crackled as operations finally reached him. They asked the same question everyone was thinking. Can you maintain altitude? Gibson didn't lie. Barely. The reply sent another wave of disbelief across the control floor. Attempts to vector him toward land began instantly, but Gibson already knew the reality. They were too far offshore, too low, too unstable. Even turning the aircraft strained the remaining wing beyond limits. But he had no intention of ejecting unless the aircraft forced the choice. Not yet. Not while there was a chance. Morrow recalculated glide potential, running numbers with the frantic accuracy of a man who knew there was no margin for error. His math confirmed what Gibson already felt in his bones. They couldn't make the coast, they couldn't make the tanker routes. They couldn't even guarantee a controlled ditching. The aircraft was simply too damaged. But what they could do was keep it alive as long as possible, long enough for help to get closer, long enough to stabilize, long enough for a miracle or a better plan. Gibson eased the throttle back, careful not to induce compressor stall. The Tomcat wavered but held. He trimmed again, the controls fighting him like muscles resisting their own exhaustion. The aircraft responded like something that wanted to survive. Minutes passed that felt like hours. The operations room tracked the agonizingly slow progress across the radar screen. Helicopter crews stood ready on deck, engines turning, waiting for the order to launch. Fighter pilots in nearby craft listened in disbelief on the radio, speechless as they heard the impossible play out in real time. Yet through all of it, Gibson never wavered. His voice remained steady, calm, surgical. The kind of calm found in pilots who had flown long enough to understand that panic was both pointless and fatal. Morrow, trying to anchor the moment, asked for a systems check. Gibson scanned the remaining instruments. Fuel pressure stable. Hydraulics degraded but functional. Electrical systems intact. Attitude controlled damage but responsive. One wing, one engine running hotter than comfortable. Airframe buffeting with every breath of wind, but still in the sky. The radio crackled again as another officer asked whether they wanted to attempt a shallow turn toward the nearest divert field. Gibson stared at the horizon. Turning meant putting more load on the remaining wing. More stress, more risk of catastrophic failure. But flying straight meant drifting farther from help. He didn't answer immediately. Morrow understood the pause better than anyone. The jet could not survive a full bank, but a fraction of a bank, executed over a long gentle arc, might be possible. Might. The word echoed silently between them. Gibson breathed once, held the stick steady, and began the slowest turn of his career. The Tomcat shuddered instantly, the left wing struggling to generate lift, while the right side bit into the drag of empty space. The nose dipped, speed bled, the horizon slid in a nauseating roll. Gibson countered with perfect precision, nudging throttle and rudder into a delicate balance that had no precedent. Morrow braced his hands on the canopy rail. The aircraft creaked, metal flexing in ways engineers never intended it to. For a moment the turn seemed doomed. Then, gradually, painfully, impossibly, the Tomcat stabilized into the new heading. A collective exhale rippled through the cockpit. In the operations room, technicians stared at the radar plot as though witnessing a ghost shift course. No aircraft missing half a wing should have been able to turn. But BU 161,597 was rewriting the rules. They held that heading for several long minutes, The ocean glimmered below in a broken mosaic of light. The sun reflected off the waves in bright pulses that flickered across the cockpit. Gibson felt sweat forming at his brow despite the ventilation blasting cold air. Morrow recalculated altitude loss. The numbers were ugly, but not hopeless. They were losing height, but slowly was enough. The radio continued with clipped instruction, but even the senior officers had shifted from command to support. They were no longer trying to control the situation. They were watching a pilot and a jet fight for their lives. When the coastline finally appeared as a faint line in the distance, it looked unreal, like a mirage rising from heat. They would never reach the runway. Gibson knew that instantly. But maybe, if he controlled every second, every inch of descent, they could reach shallow water. Or even a distant stretch of sand. The aircraft began another slight tremor. Fatigue, stress, structural pain. Morrow reported the hydraulic pressure slipping again. Gibson adjusted rudder trim. The jet protested but obeyed. Another few miles, another few seconds, another bit of borrowed time. The radio crackled again. If you need to eject, do it now. Gibson ignored it. He wasn't surrendering the aircraft. Not yet, not while it still answered him. The coastline sharpened. Land no longer felt mythical, it felt reachable. But reachable did not mean survivable. The aircraft sagged another 100 feet, then another. The asymmetry grew worse, airspeed bled faster. Gibson tightened his grip. They were out of options. Then something unexpected happened, the air smoothed. A thermal rose from the coastline, a warm upward current that brushed against the Tomcat's battered frame like a final act of mercy. The jet lifted slightly, but enough to stretch the glide. Enough to bring the ocean floor into shallower view. Enough to make the difference between death and survival. Gibson eased the throttle to idle, controlling sink rate with the precision of a surgeon. The coastline grew larger. Waves outlined the shoals. If they could reach shallow water, maybe, just maybe, they could eject cleanly. Morrow gripped the seat rails, ready. The Tomcat dropped another 100 feet, then another 50. Then the altimeter wound down into blind territory. Morrow called the numbers. Gibson responded with nothing but control inputs. The sea rose to meet them. The engine screamed, the airframe groaned. And then, at the exact moment, before physics reclaimed its debt, Gibson made the call, eject. The seats launched skyward in twin bursts of explosive force. 2 parachutes opened against the glimmering Pacific light. Below them the F-14 hit the water, sending a plume of spray rising into the air. It was over, except it wasn't, because the story wasn't about the crash. It was about how long the aircraft had refused to die, and how a pilot refused to let it. The moment the parachute canopy snapped open above Gibson, the world shrank into a sphere of rushing air, burning sunlight and the distant roar of an ocean that had nearly claimed him. For the first time since the wing tore away, he was no longer fighting the jet. For now there was only clarity, the razor-sharp kind that arrives in the seconds after survival becomes certain. Below him the Pacific glittered like broken glass, and somewhere in that shimmering reflection, the remains of the F-14 sank beneath the surface, swallowed by the same water that had nearly taken Gibson and Morrow with it. He searched the sky, heart pounding, until he spotted the second parachute. Morrow was drifting lower, descending quickly but controlled. Gibson felt a surge of relief, stronger than anything he had felt in the cockpit. A pilot can fly a jet alone, but a Tomcat was never flown alone. They were a crew, a single unit carved into 2 seats. Salt wind whipped across Gibson's face as he drifted toward the surface. The ocean rose rapidly, the color shifting from bright silver to deep blue as the parachute carried him into the final moments of the descent. He braced for impact, the way naval aviators are trained to, legs tight, chin tucked, arms loose enough to avoid injury. When he hit the water, the shock was instantaneous, cold and violent. The parachute collapsed behind him, dragging for a moment until he cut the straps with practice motions. Waves slapped against his helmet as he inflated his survival vest. Moments later, he saw Morrow splash down nearby. The ocean was calm for now, but fear had a way of creeping in around the edges. They were miles offshore, bobbing like to small fragments of life in a world of endless water. Gibson keyed his survival radio, voice steady despite the situation. 2 good shoots, both men in the water. Request immediate pickup. The response was immediate. Rescue teams had already launched. Helicopters thundered across the sky as soon as the F-14 disappeared from radar. Pilots and crew chiefs sprinted to their aircraft the moment they received confirmation of the ejection. No one hesitated. No one waited for further instructions. Naval aviators don't abandon their own. A rescue Seahawk was already cutting across the waves at high speed, guided by both radar and the unmistakable plumes of spray from the ejection seats. Gibson floated quietly, watching the sky without blinking. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind a flood of emotions that arrived in waves. Shock, relief, grief for the aircraft, gratitude for survival. Confusion about how the Tomcat had stayed airborne for so long. That confusion was shared by everyone. The Seahawk arrived within minutes, hovering above the 2 men in a thundering downwash that churned the water into froth. A rescue swimmer dropped into the ocean, cutting through the waves with powerful strokes until he reached Gibson. "You okay, sir?" Gibson nodded, though he wasn't completely sure. The swimmer clipped a rescue harness around him, signaled the hoist, and within seconds Gibson was rising through a waterfall of rotor-driven spray. When he reached the open door of the Seahawk, hands pulled him aboard with practiced force. Moments later Morrow was hoisted in and fell beside him, laughing breathlessly in the way only men who have survived death do. The rescue crew said nothing at first. They didn't need to. They had seen fear before, shock before, survival before. But even they sensed something different about this one. Something extraordinary. As the Seahawk banked toward the coastline, Gibson looked out across the ocean, scanning the surface where the Tomcat had vanished. The area was already marked by ripples and scattered debris, the faint signature of a machine that had refused to brake until the last possible second. He felt a heaviness in his chest as he watched the water swallow the last trace of the aircraft. It was not grief for metal. It was grief for what the jet had done. Back at Point Mugu, the rescue helicopter touched down to a swarm of technicians, medical staff and officers who moved toward the aircraft the moment its wheels hit the tarmac. Gibson and Morrow were escorted to the medical bay for mandatory checks. Their vitals were recorded, their suits inspected, their eyes tested for shock and trauma. Through it all, the same question came again and again from every direction, from every rank, from every voice that met them. "How did you keep her flying?" Gibson answered the same way each time. "I don't know." And it was true. There was no explanation that satisfied logic. No aerodynamic principle that justified how an F-14 with only one wing had stayed in the air for minutes instead of seconds. No engineering rationale that could explain the stability he had felt near the end. But there was something else he understood, something deeper, something pilots learned only through thousands of hours in the sky. Aircraft are born from mathematics, but they live through instinct. Every machine has a personality. Every machine has a threshold, and some machines have a will. When the medical checks were done, the 2 men were escorted to a small conference room where senior officers, engineers, and test directors gathered around a large table. Radar plots were displayed on one screen, debris field maps on another, shocked expressions everywhere. The lead investigator spoke first. "We need to know everything, Commander. Every detail. Start from the moment you released the test store." Gibson sat quietly, replaying the events in his mind. He recalled the vibration, the sudden wrench, the moment sunlight flashed across the cockpit when the wing sheared away. He recalled the immediate spin, the violent torque roll that should have sent them tumbling beyond recovery. He recalled the control inputs, the hydraulic warnings, the buffeting that shook his bones. He recalled the moment the horizon steadied, just enough for him to believe the jet wasn't finished. And then he said the one thing no one expected. "It felt like she wanted to fly. The room went silent. Engineers exchanged glances. They would never write that into an official report. The Navy didn't operate on sentiment. Some aircraft carried more than engineering. They carried history, legacy, defiance, and the F-14 was all of those things. The investigation continued for hours, reconstructing every movement of the Tomcat's final minutes. The structural design of the F-14, combined with the geometry of its variable sweep wings, had created a perfect storm of unlikely survivability. The left wing generated just enough lift, the stabilizers just enough control authority, the fuselage just enough aerodynamic balance. Everything had aligned in a fragile, temporary equilibrium that existed for only one reason. Gibson had flown the aircraft with precision no simulator could replicate. He had felt what the jet needed before the instruments showed it. He had done something that would likely never be repeated. Young pilots told the story in ready rooms. Old pilots nodded quietly, understanding the deeper meaning. Engineers shook their heads in disbelief. The F-14 community treated it as proof of what they already believed. Their survival was cited as a testament to training, discipline, and the unspoken bond between pilot, Rio, and machine. The wreckage of the Tomcat was never fully recovered. The Pacific kept most of it, holding the secret of how long the aircraft had resisted its own destruction. Years later, long after the F-14 retired from active service, the story resurfaced again and again. Aviation historians wrote about it, test pilots referenced it. And every time the tale was told, every time a new generation of aviators heard it, the same truth returned. Some aircraft are built to fight, others are built to endure, but only a few are built to defy. And in the world of aviation, that is not engineering. That is legacy, the kind that never sinks, the kind that never ends, the kind that flies long after the aircraft itself is gone.